Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention, please. And first of all, welcome back to the OEB debate. It's fantastic to have you back again, it really is. And we're seeing so many old friends. It's a magnificent feeling and wonderful to have so many people back for this event, which has become, in the past, something of a highlight of the conference. So I hope that you will enjoy it as much as you have done on previous occasions, and that those who are new to it will enjoy it just as much. We've got a great lineup of speakers today who are going to argue both sides, each side of a motion. And the motion is that this House believes education has failed to learn the lesson of Covid-19. And so for those who haven't been to these debates before, we'll run this in a kind of loosely parliamentary side. So I will ask two speakers I'll ask one speaker from the proposition to propose the motion, then a speaker from the opposition to oppose it, then another speaker for the proposition and one speaker against. And they'll each speak for about 10 minutes, and then I will throw the discussion open to the floor. And I hope that you will then take the opportunity to ask questions or intervene, give us your contributions, your thoughts. Tell us about your experience of the pandemic, because of course everybody has had a unique experience. I'm not allowed to take one side or the other, but I've certainly got my views. I edited the eLearning Africa report on the experience of African institutions under COVID, which is available on the eLearning Africa website if anybody's interested. And I also went back to university and have been doing some part-time postgraduate legal studies, all of which has conditioned my outlook on what the response of education has been to the pandemic. But as I say, everybody has got their own unique experience, and so I very much hope that we will hear from you about your experience and whether you think that there are lessons to be learned. It may well be that you may think that there are no lessons to be learned, or that there are a lesson to be learned, or that there is one particular lesson. All these things are implicit in the motion, and our expert speakers will interpret that particular motion in whatever way they think is fit. And then, as I say, I'll throw the discussion open to the floor, and then each side will sum up, and then we will take a vote by a show of hands. So I'm now, without further ado, going to call on our first speaker to propose the motion. And our first speaker is Hilary Gyebi-Ababio, who is the Vice President for Higher Education of the UK's National Union of Students. And she was previously the Undergraduate Education Officer and Chair of the Widening Participation Network at the University of Bristol Students' Union. She's a champion of students who's worked on many projects that have looked to support the most marginal students in education and beyond. From decolonisation to widening access work, she's extremely passionate in ensuring that students are at the centre of education and are the architects of their own education. Hilary.
Thank you. Good evening. Dear Mr. Speaker, I believe that the motion that the House believes education has failed to learn the lesson of COVID-19 is correct, and it is blatant and unavoidable that this is the truth. Education should be central in our society, ahead of the curve in times and seasons of big change, and yet, whilst the world adjusted to dealing with a pandemic, institutions were left flailing, leaving students financially unstable and unequipped for their education, leaving staff stretched, delivering emergency remote learning, and showing that with what could have been learnt from COVID-19, education was the place where learning was not being done. So before I go into my points, I'm going to quiz you all at the end. I know this is not traditional, but hey, it's a pandemic. Everything goes in this debate. So please be vocal when I call on you. But I'm just going to teach you one lesson, something to remember for later. Here is the lesson. Very, very silly lesson. But to cook an egg, you must boil it. That's the lesson over. Don't go home, please. I've still got more to say. Now to my argument. There are 3 points I will make that will encapsulate the extent to which education has failed to learn the lessons of COVID-19. Number 1, students have been exploited, and that has only been amplified during COVID. Students are made to pay exorbitant fees to access learning. This immediately creates a narrative of education as a product. If institutions and governments are seeing education as a product, then throughout COVID, it definitely was on clearance. Low on quality of online delivery, low on staff and student working conditions, and no refunds allowed. Fundamentally, it is a problem to see education as something to be bought and sold, something to get value for money on, and something to be refunded. So let's be clear. Students don't come to university or any form of education to go shopping for a degree. They come to learn, discover, and enjoy themselves. The narrative of consumerism in education creates a power imbalance, and it leads to a society that views education as a transaction, and this benefits no one. And throughout COVID, students may have made savings on travel from staying at home, but they paid a heavy price for education. To focus on just a system built on fees, in turn, has made things like refunds and value for money a focus for students during the pandemic, rather than the duty of care institutions have for students, staff, and for the integrity and quality of education. At the heart of this, education has misunderstood and ignored how much students value their learning. And as partners in their education, students should have an equal stake and voice in finding the solutions to the problems caused by the pandemic. And during the pandemic, this couldn't be any more clear. Education looked at students in their bedrooms and thought cozy instead of cramped, cold, and uncomfortable. COVID showed us the cruel reality of inequality and inequity by an already behind and outdated education system defending tradition over innovation, progress, and vitally students. This is all before we even look at adjacent issues, the woeful state of student housing, where many students have been trapped in lockdowns or have been charged for housing that they haven't been able to live in. Their mental health has been seriously impacted over the last 2 years, with research from us at NUS UK finding over half of students in the UK struggled with loneliness, anxiety, and depression among some of the key experiences they identified with us. These pre-existing flaws in education have led to serious issues in the pandemic. Furthermore, even when the pandemic eventually ends, these chasms that have been exposed will not simply disappear. Number 2, online education hasn't been realized by education, just emergency remote learning has. We know that digital access to education has been something students have pushed for a very long time. In particular, disabled students, students with access needs, students who are parents and carers, students who commute to campus have campaigned for digital access to lectures and resources. Online education was never conceptualized as press and copy and paste onto a Zoom lecture from the already dying lecture theatre. Thinking students would love to be put to bed by PowerPoint just because they could now attend lectures in pajamas and dressing gowns was a clear failure of education from learning from COVID. Giving credit where credit is due, though, academics worked hard to implement online learning and digital access under immense pressure and difficult circumstances, and developed and delivered lectures, seminars, and exams online. But instead of using COVID as an opportunity to overhaul the dying traditional lecture and to invest in an educational experience that valued student agency, choice, and learning, all education learnt was that we could hit record and upload a lecture, something that has been happening on YouTube for over 10 years now. Online lectures, remote access to resources, and other digital provision has significantly improved access to education. And alongside, and I really want to emphasize, alongside in-person teaching, gives students greater choice over how they learn. Making education accessible should be a top priority for us all. Instead, the higher education sector has proven that it has still not learnt the lessons of the pandemic by pushing an agenda of trying to return back to normal. Those that are still offering a form of blended learning are still, by and large, touting that this emergency remote learning is a success for online education. And let me be clear, what I'm arguing for is not a wholly online experience. We have seen the problems this has caused for students, from feeling isolated, to difficulty engaging, to Zoom fatigue. However, the inclusion of digital learning as a truly open model which allows students the agency to learn is vital in getting us to a place where we can really move to an education system that is truly innovative and valuable for students. And finally, number 3, higher education needs an overhaul. So it's quiz time. I'm going to choose a few of you, so please feel free to put your hands up. But I want to ask what I asked at the start. So what must you do to cook an egg? What did you learn from right at the start of my speech? Feel free to put your hands up and let me know, what must you do to cook an egg? Boil it. Interesting. Fundamentally, boil it. Fry it. Interesting. Fundamentally, what we've all just experienced in that little experience in the current system is the flaw in the current system that education is trying to sustain. We assess students through blind regurgitation stemming from a lack of trust in their ability to learn. We only innovate in emergency ways, finding new ways to put students to sleep rather than beckoning them to awaken their curiosity and potential. And we run, and I mean run, back to comfortability, even when crises like COVID tell us that we must change. Fundamentally, higher education needs an overhaul, and it needs it now. The pandemic has proven that higher education will descend into chaos when we cannot rely on normal. And when I say normal, I mean outdated modes of delivery that desperately need to catch up to the times that we live in now. Taking advantage of new technologies and re-envisioning what education could look like if we were to start again and build it today is how we create a system that not only works for the students of today, but is prepared for the problems of tomorrow. Students have been failed by a system refusing to be reinvented and re-envisioned. So education did learn something, but it has not learnt the lessons of COVID-19. And as my peers would say, and if you watch TikToks, you'll get the reference, it did not understand the assignment. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Hilary. And now, to oppose the motion, I'm going to call somebody who's an old favourite at these events. I'd say if he was a plant, he'd probably be a hardy perennial. Donald Clark, I can almost recite his CV off by heart because I've introduced him so many times. But for those of you who don't know Donald, he is an entrepreneur, chief executive, professor, speaker, and blogger. He was the chief executive and one of the original founders of the Epic Group PLC, which established itself as the leading company in the UK eLearning market. He's now the CEO of an AI learning company, Wildfire. He's an investor and a board member of Plan B Learning, the Learning Pool, and Cogbooks, and he's been involved in consulting and implementing online learning in schools, FE, HE, corporate, and government. And he's been involved in film, games, web, mobile, MOOCs, Oculus Rift, and he's won many awards for the design and implementation of online learning. And of course, he's well known as an extremely controversial blogger on learning. So over to you, Donald.
Thank you, Harold. Good evening, everyone. Hilary asked us to feel sorry for those poor students in their pajamas, in their dressing gowns. Are you kidding me? Are you kidding? Is that what education is? Just students? Really? You know, the truth of the matter is we should be thinking about the people who worked in care homes, the delivery drivers, the lorry drivers, the factory workers, the policemen, the bus drivers, the train drivers, the people who delivered things to us while we were stuck, suffering from Zoom fatigue. Really? We're complaining about Zoom fatigue when people were dying out there on our behalf? Is that what we really think education is? Mollycoddling students? Or is education a big, big issue in the third world? In schools? And of course, the majority of us are adults who have left university in the workplace as well. So I want to get out of this miserableism, this culture of complaint that we have these little groups of largely middle-class kids who suffered so badly during COVID. Suffered so badly when some countries had 150,000 deaths. I don't think that's a particularly relevant line of inquiry. And so I'm going to give you 7 arguments as to why, when I saw this proposition, sorry it's not up here, that we had failed during COVID, that educators had failed, I thought, are you kidding me? Do you know any people who really had to switch the light on and get on with this teaching students during COVID? It happened to us. COVID was an external cause. And so I think we ought to avoid this big sulk, for the wealthier people in society and perhaps see COVID as a big push. What actually happened in COVID was that an external cause came in and forced us, but sometimes out of trauma, out of bad things, good things come. And I think that's what happened here, really. We were all forced to teach online, and there are many, many advantages to that. So let's get out of the big sulk and think about the big push here that was a thoroughly good thing because it's pushed us forward progressively into the new world that we've spent years discussing at this conference. So a second argument, a peculiar thing happened in England that in 2020, the results in schools went up. The kids weren't in school, they went up. We had an increase among students in first-class honours degrees from 27% to over 30%. The results went up. So what happened to those poor students in their pajamas? They got better bloody results. How do you explain that it actually got better? Well, let me give it a bash then. First of all, I think there was genuinely more teaching. I've lectured all my life. Lectures are easy. Lecturing is really easy. Teaching is really hard. Lecturing is easy and teaching is hard. And what many, many people had to do, and we witnessed this, is step up to the plate, raise their games, and start teaching. Very often for the first time. Because it's difficult when your audience is at a distance and you really have to pull out the stops to engage them, call them by their first name, get that social dynamic going. That's hard work. And I think we did step up to the plate. I think there are a lot of heroes in that front who had to change their game quickly and did it well. And rather than the word resilience, I'd use the word adaptability. I think lots of people became incredibly adaptable during this period, especially teachers, especially faculty in universities, but also people in workplace learning. Remember, education's this broad canvas. I also think in many occasions there was almost, you might call it better teaching and learning. And I'm going to give you a quote from a great hero of mine, a guy called Eric Mazur. Eric Mazur has been teaching physics at Harvard for many, many years. And he was a big, big researcher on how to make your lectures better. So he had this amazing bit of data. He's a real data guy, showing that the further back students were in the lecture hall, there was an absolute correspondence with lower results. Sorry, you guys at the back, but his assumption was they're all on Facebook and Instagram or something, But he was right in a way. And what he found when he had to go online, and I'll read it from him, "I have never been able to offer a course of the quality that I'm offering now. I am convinced that there is no way I could do anything close to what I was doing in person. Online teaching is better than in person," and he proved it by increased attainment. And then he says something really interesting. He says it's almost unethical to return to classroom teaching as it was before. Almost unethical, because when you teach online, every single student is sitting in the front row. It's a really important point, this. There's nowhere to hide in online learning. You're there. You have to do it. Learners have to learn, teachers have to teach. My fifth argument is that we saw this massive, almost forced, but still a good thing, increase in digital literacy and skills. Not just, how do I use this Zoom stuff, But we also found amongst the teaching fraternity, certainly, and I've been doing teaching online for many, many years, but even I found that I learned some amazing things during COVID. One was a very fascinating bit of research out at Carnegie Mellon. I think we learned a lot about online learning, was that students, when you're teaching students online, get them to switch their video off because they're self-conscious about how they look at that age and also don't want to betray the fact that they maybe have a poorer home than other students. So, even though I've been at this game for a long time, I found that I learned an amazing number of new skills because I had to do it more consistently and to a higher quality. And I think we faced up to the digital divide issue as well. In England, there was 1.3 million laptops given out to poorer kids in schools. I think that was a good thing. I think that's socially progressive, rather than pandering to the students in their pajamas. And then, during the pandemic recently, in Glasgow, as you can tell, I'm Scottish, come from that part of the world, we had COP26, where Greta Thunberg constantly told us to ignore the blah, blah, blah. But who did step up to the plate? Educators stood up to the plate. Online learning is a green product. I'm actually not a big fan of the English system in universities where every kid has to travel hundreds of miles to stay for 4 years. I'm not even a big fan of Erasmus, a €30 billion project to fly kids around Europe. Are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? What's green about that? And I think we should be stepping up to the plate and recognizing that online learning is actually green learning. And let me finish on this really uncomfortable truth, because it's important. There's a big moral dimension to all this, that not everyone is in school. Not everyone is in university. Now, we heard from Harold, I think it was really fascinating. Harold's roughly the same age as me. We have our birthdays within 3 days of each other next week. And Harold has gone back to university. What a fantastic, I was amazed, And you speak to Harold about it, he is absolutely loving it. Absolutely loving it. And I find that I speak to people all the time about new skills they picked up during COVID. It may be something simpler like gardening or a new hobby. I myself was a bit nerdy and I got interested in Anglo-Saxon churches in England. I know, it's a bit weird. But there are lots of them in the area I live in. And I got a dog for the first time during COVID. Changed my life. I've never had a dog before. Honestly, I love my dog because it got me out walking twice a day to these churches. So I found myself listening to podcasts when I was walking. It expanded my horizons in terms of learning. And I'll go back to the point I made at the beginning about frontline workers. The people in social care homes, the nurses, the delivery drivers, supermarkets. Oh, no, these people didn't go to university. They didn't have that privilege. That's why they're in those jobs. But they did us proud. While we sat at home complaining about Zoom fatigue, they were doing full-time jobs and risking their lives for us. But I think we, in our own way as educators, did step up to the plate. We managed to increase our skills. I think we did well by our students, as best we could, because we adapted to those changes. And that's a good thing to do, to adapt to those changes. So I think all of you, and there are many of you in this room who made that change, I think you all did us proud. I honestly think you did us proud, because I think we owe it to those people who were out there doing the heroic work to also come up and step alongside them to deliver what we had to deliver, which is learning, whether you're a school teacher or in a technical college or in a university or in workplace learning for adults. We all stepped up to the plate. So I ask you to vote against this motion. We didn't fail. COVID didn't win. We adapted and we passed. We didn't fail, we passed and succeeded. So I will toast all those people out there. I brought a beer up to toast all those workers who did help us through all this. And secondly, to all those teachers who did a bloody good job in adapting to very difficult circumstances. Cheers, folks. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Donald. So I'm now going to call our next speaker, Jürgen Handke, who will speak in favour of the motion. And Jürgen is, above all, a teacher. He's had 40 years experience in teaching, and 25 years of that has been in digital. He manages the virtual linguistics campus, which is an open resources online platform for languages, linguistics, education, and robotics. Since 2006, he's been teaching in the inverted classroom scenario. Since 2009, all his linguistics exams have been electronic, and since 2016, he has been using humanoid robots in the classroom. So Jürgen Handke is a linguist, an educator, an award-winning digital learning and teaching pioneer. Jürgen.
Yeah, thank you very much. Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, I will of course vote for the motion that we have failed to learn the lesson of COVID-19. But I should be a little bit more precise. I should really change that sentence a little bit, and I would say we learned the wrong lessons of COVID-19. And by we and education, I mean teachers and institutions. Hillary has been talking about the students. I will take the teacher role now because I think I was quite good at that. Now, before Corona, and first of all, one thing about teachers. You are not really the target of what I'm saying because you are all very close with digital media, with digital technologies. You have experienced them. What I'm aiming at is the majority of teachers, those thousands of teachers who have 8 hours teaching capacity per week, standing in front of 100 and more students. That's the target group, and that's the vast majority, at least in the country where I come from, Germany. So you're really the wrong target. Is there anyone in the audience who is a teacher with 8 hours or more teaching capacity, teaching every week, standing in front of students more than 100? You see, one of them is here. So that is what I expected. Anyway, what was teaching like before Corona? Before Corona, we stood in the classroom, and the main method of content delivery, that's what I'm focusing on, was basically a method of standing in front of the audience at one particular time, in one particular place, with a teacher-dictated delivery tempo, content delivery tempo, and one-size-fits-all material for the students. This is the classical teaching scenario, the synchronous in-class teaching, or as Alison King put it in 1991, an American pedagogist, the role of the teacher was that of a sage on the stage. So this was the position, the wise man, the caretaker of knowledge on the stage. This is what I'm doing right now. But long before Corona, this sort of teaching had come under attack. With the increasing sophistication of the internet, more and more online and digital content became available. And so people thought about new scenarios of teaching and learning. Long before Corona, at lunchtime, I met 3 Dutch ladies who told me they've been doing this for ages. And this new scenario would allow students to be engaged in self-guided learning, and the teacher would change his role, and I'm acting it out now, from sage on stage to guide on the side. And this is where I am now. I'm the guide on the side, not your personal guide, but your guide. So this would be my normal position in this scenario, the guide on the side, because teaching and content delivery is now digital. So I can advise you in deepening knowledge, but I won't deliver content anymore. And if you have a question, what is a morpheme, sir? I would say, do what you always do. You know what I mean? Google. But people were not ready before Corona for such scenarios, except these 3 ladies I met and perhaps a few more. So what did we do? We went back on stage before Corona and were sages on the stage again. But then Corona struck, and the classrooms were closed. The sage on stage was no more any reality. So instead of using the digital content and accelerating the production of digital content, what all these companies like, they would have liked it. What did we do? We invented a new style of teaching and called it online teaching. But really it was this, and this is my new position, from sage on stage to sage behind a webcam. So here I am, behind a webcam. This teaching method, which didacticians soon referred to as emergency remote teaching — Hilary mentioned the term emergency remote learning — which had never received any support apart from scalability and cost effectiveness in adult education, had for a long time been rejected as a suitable model of 21st century learning. By the way, has anyone in the audience ever thought about using emergency remote teaching before Corona for content delivery? Possibly not. The main problem is lack of interaction. You can hardly see me, you can hardly see anyone. Oh, by the way, something changed. I wanted to bring along a pair of jogging trousers. I didn't. But you can't see the lower half of my body now. That is a change. Thank you, Corona. And there's another change. This morning we were welcomed by saying good morning, and we had to repeat it 5 times. You know what happens now? Here I am in my video conference. Can you hear me? Can you please switch off your mic? Can you see my presentation? These are new, didactically totally irrelevant discourse markers of this new scenario. And what did the institutions do? They call it online teaching, a term which was used completely differently a long time before. So this is really a very bad thing. The media really tends to believe it. They say, now, okay, they've got something new. Online teaching. It is emergency remote teaching, nothing else. Recently, on Twitter, I was engaged in a dialogue, and I asked the German institution, please don't call it online teaching if you mean video conferencing. They wrote back, we refer to the variety of tools we're applying in virtual knowledge transfer. Oh, great, I thought. I wrote back, can you give me examples? I never received an answer. This is the situation. And what happens after Corona now, if there is an after? Well, the newspapers already wrote it, in Germany at least. They now combine 2 methods, the outdated method of being sage on the stage and the never wanted method of video conferencing, which they call online teaching, and they invented a new label for it, hybrid teaching. And again, the public tends to believe that this is the case. This is nothing new at all. Before I finish, let me say something about assessment. Assessment is for me part of digital teaching and learning. Now, when we had the lockdown, the classrooms were closed, and so were the halls where we wrote exams. No problem for written exams, they were simply uploaded. But what happened to electronic exams? The first thing everyone thought about, how can we avoid cheating? Supervision was the new word, and the new magic word was proctoring. Isn't that ridiculous that we are looking at a system that prevents us from using what we use 24 hours, 7 days a week, the internet? I thought about different exams in 2016. New structures of exams, competence-based testing and not knowledge testing. And then you can allow open exams, open book exams, which we've done for 5 years, and that's what we need. And then we will never talk about proctoring again. By the way, one nice effect of proctoring is students kept their rooms tidy. But that's something I do not want to go into. Well, ladies and gentlemen, let me summarize. 7 years ago, in one of my monographs, I quoted Shirley Philpman, former president of Princeton University. And she said, if we sent the president of the United States of 1913, who was Woodrow Wilson, into a classroom of today, he wouldn't know much of a difference. With one exception in 2014, PowerPoint. Today, it's still the same. The classroom is there, the old architectures are there, PowerPoint is there, but a few cameras occur from time to time and maybe an interactive panel, but that's it. And the worst thing I haven't mentioned yet. For ages, we have been talking about the principle that didactics must drive technology. But what has happened? Technology has now driven didactics, something we never wanted. And we really have to reverse that as quickly as possible. So I don't think we have learned, I do think we learned a little bit, but we learned the wrong things from Corona, from COVID-19. So please support me by voting for the motion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jürgen. Our final speaker is Mark West, who's going to speak against the motion. And Mark is an education specialist from UNESCO. He works in UNESCO's education sector, where he examines how technology can improve the quality, equity and accessibility of learning. He's currently leading a project to develop a global declaration on connectivity for education and authoring a UNESCO report called An EdTech Tragedy about lessons learned following the global shift from school-based education to technology-based education during the Covid-19 pandemic. He's also active in outlining guidance to make digital solutions more inclusive for people with low literacy skills, helping governments enact policies and practices to ensure that women and girls develop strong digital skills, and reviewing educational innovations. He's written extensively about technology and education, and his most recent publication led Apple and other technology companies to make major changes to the way Siri and other AI assistants project gender. And prior to joining UNESCO in 2011, he researched education in Azerbaijan as a Fulbright Fellow and worked as a teacher and teacher trainer in the United States. Mark.
Thank you very much, Harold. I want to return to our motion. Our motion says that we have failed to learn lessons from the pandemic. So I was incredibly encouraged to hear the opposition talk about all the lessons that they had drawn. We heard Jürgen talk about that we have learned the wrong lessons from the pandemic. And then he elaborated the many wrong lessons that we have learned. Those are still lessons. We go to conferences all the time that tell us to learn from failure. And I think we can all agree that there have been a lot of failures over the past almost 2 years, and that we have learned tremendous lessons from those failures. My partner Donald, he outlined some of the many ways that this has been an experience that pushed us into new horizons. And I think we can agree that this has indeed been a sort of nudge into this digital future where we know we're going. Was it always the right nudge? Probably not. But did we gain lessons from it? Absolutely. So again, the motion asks, have we learned lessons? Have we ever? We have learned many lessons. So my friends on the other side of this debate must think that we need to keep our heads in the sand, that we didn't actually extract lessons. Don't be fooled. The education community was paying attention. We were scribbling in our notebooks, documenting, observing, analyzing, and yes, acting to change. So you ask, what have we learned? What lessons did we extract? And this is where I'm going to deviate a bit from Donald. In a line, we have been warned. We've been warned that the digital transformation of education is on a dangerous trajectory. The pandemic has awakened us to the reality that we are careening towards dystopic lands. It's not pretty, but we have learned. We know that technology first and technology only approaches to school closures have caused, despite our best efforts, and ushered in a world where exclusion was rampant, inequalities were supercharged, and quality was compromised. We previewed a frightening new world, a world where student engagement with learning declined, a world of screen-exhausted students and teachers, a world where holistic student well-being was often disregarded, a world where diverse objectives we usually attach to education, including acculturation, civic learning, coming into being in a community of peers, and emotional learning, to name just a few, narrowed to just academic learning. These are sobering experiences and sobering learnings, but they are nevertheless learnings we drew from the experience of the pandemic, and aren't we glad we did? What else did we learn? We learned that our current models of EdTech have normalized learning in isolation, that our models for EdTech have ripped education out of the public domain and often handed it over to private, often for-profit providers, that our current models for EdTech undermine norms laboriously built over centuries, that education is a public and a common good. There's still more lessons. We discovered that the EdTech commonly positioned education as a private good, something that is bought and sold for the benefit of individuals. We saw learning that is more me rather than learning that is we and us. We saw that our current models of digital learning ask education to contort to technology rather than the other way around. Technology bending to the needs of students, of teachers, and of schools. We saw children shoved into bodiless, touchless worlds, concerned only with the cognitive and ignored the corporal. It was a forced disassociation from students' own bodies and the bodies of others. We also witnessed an Orwellian nightmare of data extraction, surveillance, and control. Student data being sucked up by companies to better sell advertising. Students being shoved into digital space designed not for learning, but for addiction. We saw the rise of EdTech systems that were crafted to identify and silence ideas deemed dangerous, often to state actors. We saw the rise of mute all buttons. We saw experiences where students could be ejected from a learning space with the touch of a button. It's little wonder that some of the most enthusiastic boosters of EdTech are autocratic regimes. What we observed would cause John Dewey and other proponents of education for democracy to roll in their graves. UNESCO, as mentioned, will publish a book early next year. Its title is An EdTech Tragedy. The choice of the word tragedy is intentional. We use the word tragedy because in tragedy is learning and recognition, new knowledge and new perspectives. And I think we can all agree that we can walk away with from this experience with new knowledge and new perspectives. We have all drawn different lessons from this experience. I'm painting a fairly dark view of some of what we've drawn from this. Let me give you 4 lessons that I walked away with. The first lesson, the space of the school is sacrosanct. Although we often pretend that the main purpose of a school is curricular learning, its purposes, both latent and explicit, are far wider and far richer. We saw the value of schools anew with their closure. We have come to better recognize the many ways they help assure the holistic well-being of students. They provide protection. They provide nutrition. They are concerned with the social-emotional development as well as facilitating academic progress. They are a corrective to the current obsession with technology-guided personal learning. Beyond this, they are hubs for social services for children, places that provide necessary links to healthcare, housing assistance, psychological support. Schools are, in a word, critical infrastructure. We didn't quite understand that before the pandemic, and I think that after the pandemic, we understand that with great clarity. Lesson number 2. Ownership and control of connected technologies must be universal if education is to continue moving into digital spaces. Without this, connected learning is exclusionary by design. The defining characteristic of EdTech at the global level, at the very moment it was trumpeted as a tool of educational resilience, was less its effectiveness or lack of effectiveness than its absence. For most students in the world, there was no EdTech learning. We're sitting here in Germany, in the heart of Europe. In this context, yes, but for most students globally, connected learning equated with no learning. Lesson number 3. Let's stop with the myth that EdTech is a singular ticket to educational resilience. Tech companies like this idea because it sells their products. But it's not true. If anything, EdTech is remarkably fragile. Water is mortal to electronics, dust as well. Screens break, buttons lock, connectivity is not much better. Wi-Fi routers fail, networks go down, mobile towers misfunction, internet cables get cut. We've all seen this. People, not machines, not software, remain the backbone of education systems and the cornerstone of educational resilience. Investments in the capacities of people, especially the capacities of teachers, remain the surest route to ensuring inclusive, equitable, and good quality education. Teachers are the cornerstone of educational resilience. Lesson number 4, EdTech needs to better enable learning in a community and facilitate the free exploration of ideas and knowledge. What we saw during the pandemic was often the opposite. Despite the much-touted promise of EdTech to democratize education and unshackle it from industrial modes of learning, the reality of its implementation during the pandemic was often automation of the educational experience. I don't know about you, but I went to school in Western Colorado, and while my school may look very similar to some of the schools of my fellow panelists, it was often very different than the digital space. For many students, their experience of EdTech was Google Classroom or Zoom, a corporate space. So we lost a lot of the diversity in our education systems. So I conclude that anyone who failed to glean lessons from the largest educational disruption and the biggest experiment in EdTech ever doesn't deserve the label of educator. The only vote possible on this motion is no. Surely we have not failed to learn lessons from this experience. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Right, ladies and gentlemen, you've heard the arguments on both sides of the debate. And just to remind you, the motion is this House believes education has failed to learn the lesson of COVID-19. So it's over to you now. We've got about 20 minutes for contributions, brief speeches, brief, I emphasize, and let us know your views, your experience, anything that you would like to contribute to the debate, and then I'll ask one speaker from either side to sum up. So who would like to start off? If I can just about see the back, but it's quite bright light here. Yeah, I've got one on the right-hand side as I see it, just on the aisle. Thank you.
Hi, Brian Mulligan from IT Sligo in Ireland. I'd like to commend Hilary on her speech. The speech was excellent, but to some extent, I think it proved the opposite point. I had given presentations to Students' Union in the past, and I had pointed out to them that their interests were not necessarily aligned with those of faculty or lecturers, that there was a lot more that lecturers could do for them than they were doing. And I felt that the students' unions didn't really realize this. I could say that one great learning in the COVID was that students' unions have now realized that more can be done for them, and they're demanding more. In a survey of students during COVID, they made a very simple request. They said, we want to keep recordings. And despite the misgivings about Zoom classes, one of the great things about Zoom classes was it generated recordings, and even simple recordings are extremely valuable, and the students know this, and they're now asking for that. So I think I would like the students to learn even more is that they do need to be demanding more from their lecturers. Their interests are not that aligned. I think they have learned that a bit, and they should learn more about that.
Okay, thank you for that, Brian. Just take a brief response from Hilary on that, and if the other side want to comment as well. But
Sure. I think that's a really interesting and important contribution. I think, yes, students have so much more that they want and so much more that they can demand, but I have to say that I don't think anything I said went against the motion, simply because it has been years and years and years before COVID even happened that students were asking for lecture capture, for online delivery, for a flexibility and agency to how they access their education. And I think often what education, and when I speak about education, I think about institutions and people making those decisions, what they often fail to recognize is that the stuff that student unions and students are talking about are years ahead of the change that they're willing to make. And so often we see that the lessons that education needed to learn haven't been made because universities and institutions and educational spaces want to stay in the safety of the traditional and incremental change rather than making that big transformational change. That would mean that when COVID hit, we wouldn't have had to scramble to make online learning a thing, and rather we would have listened to the students, the disabled students, students with access needs, students that needed that type of learning from when they asked for it, and we would have been able to give students learning that they had already been able to adapt to, recognize, and really thrive from. So thank you for your contributions, but I really do believe that it feeds even more to the point that education has failed to learn the lessons of COVID-19, much of which students had been telling education to innovate and grow on anyway.
Thanks, Hilary. Do you want to comment, either of you, on that particular point?
I just agree with Brian's point here. You know, my point about the big push was this was an external cause, COVID, but it forced our hands to get rid of these things. To get rid of the idea. I mean, my son went to a European university in the Netherlands, did a degree which was 50% pure mathematics, and not one lecture was recorded, not one. The students petitioned faculty, never happened, still doesn't happen. But when COVID came along, they had to. This will result in a much greater learning for the students. These are 2.5-hour long lectures in calculus. So I think we have seen, and in many ways, everybody, to be fair, most educators and universities realize that recorded lectures are a good thing and we've got on with it. But there still were these huge pockets where their hands were forced, and that's been a thoroughly good thing. Everybody's been brought in to a degree into the 20th century. And I sort of disagree with the idea that, this binary split between private sector as this evil vulture and the public sector is beautiful and good. Zoom is free. Many of these organizations actually provided a lot of the services for free. And this notion that you're sucking up data for advertising is a bit odd. It's actually not that valuable, the data, in terms of people who are using Zoom. But so I think Brian is right in his observation here, yeah.
Thanks for that. Yes, down here on the left, lady in the third row.
Hi, thank you for all the contributions. For a lot of things that I am also a student. And I would say that a lot is also learned about the mindset, and also that the mindset should be changed for either the student, the teacher, and the institutions as well. And I want to show an example that, for instance, during the COVID pandemic, there's of course a lot has been changed, online lessons, as well as that, for instance, now we are in the Netherlands back at school, and we're working on projects with the mindset from the teachers that we're actually in a normal time. So, for instance, I'm an art academy student and I work on projects that I need to work with case studies, and now I'm working with a case study with children of the age of 4 and 5. But during the pandemic, and which is also still ongoing, I cannot go to those to that target group because the schools are having problems with teaching, being behind on teaching, or COVID cases as well. So they still think that because we're back at school and not wanting to use online classes because, we're able to go back to school again, we cannot still do the assignments in a normal way. So the mindset of using actually all the new tools that we have learned during the pandemic and all the wrongness and goodness about it as well is being a bit disregarded right now, at least in my case. So I would say that there is a lot learned, and I actually completely agreed with Mark West, even though I thought that I would actually be on the side of going for the motion, but I think that there's a lot learned about what is actually not being good right now. So that's what I want to say.
Thank you for that. Yes. Rupert.
So,
there.
Rupert Ward from University of Huddersfield. I'll just start with a point about education in general, which is it's not a product, it's a service. And probably the most accurate analogy is gym membership. So you go along to the gym instructors are there to help support you, but you've got to engage with it yourself. Okay, and so the point really I want to make here is that if you go along to learning gym, to do that effectively, the best way of doing that is to have a personal trainer. It's to have somebody there that can help support you in your individual needs. And we've got the technology now to enable us to cater and provide education to each person to suit their needs, and we're not delivering on that. Okay, so for me, the biggest failure of the pandemic is we haven't shifted towards personalized learning in the way that we've been trying to do for the last 15, 20 years, and hopefully within the next few years we will do that.
Thank you for that. Yes, down on just on the aisle here near the middle, right down in the center. There you go.
They're all talking about technology.
Hello. Thank you very much for your speeches. My name is Cyril Bedell. I worked with EduNow, and we're working with an open source technology named Moodle. And actually, I had a question, and I really thank you for your speeches, which is, who is education in the sentence that is shown in front of us?
But I'm sorry, we can't hear. Can you just
1, 2, 3?
move the mask a little bit, because it's very difficult to hear.
Is this better now?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Sorry. So I wanted to thank you first for your speeches, and I was wondering, reading the sentence behind you, which is, who is education? And I really feel education is every one of us in this room, and unlike some of the things I've heard, I think we've all achieved something, which is we do not have to tell anymore to people around us what EdTech means. We do not have to tell people around us what online learning means. We don't have to tell people what great things some teachers and students have achieved together. And we're just facing a great challenge, which is education is not going to be the same anymore at all. There will be sacrosanct schools, of course, there will be universities, there will be research, but we don't know what education will be in a few years from now. And it will change, as most of the things we have done so far, without and then with technology. So I don't know who should be awarded for achieving or failing changing education with technologies, but I think we all do every day. And we happen to promote open source technologies because we feel they leave room for everybody to contribute to this massive change that we're facing and actually participating into. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to take 3 more, I think, if there are 3 more, and then we'll sum up. Yes, down at the front here.
Being forced to do it isn't learning, it's being forced to change.
Up the back. Up the back at the left hand side and the right hand side.
Yeah.
Thank you. Zach Wolfit from In Holland in the Netherlands. When I'm looking at the concept of learn, what is it to learn? It's about longer term change in behavior. So I think it's quite early now to say that we have learned. I think we'll only be able to tell that in a few years from now. If I think short term, I don't see so much learning going on with colleagues returning to previous behavior.
Thank you. Then there's a lady down on the right-hand side there. Yeah. So Mark summing up for you. Mark is summing up.
So Kim Sampson from Beaver Country Day in Boston, Massachusetts. I just really completely agree with what the man just said. So I have to say my hand was raised, and that's exactly what I want to say, that if learning is about application, then we have no idea what the future really entails in terms of the answer to this question. But I also want to just say that I don't think we've really addressed the fact that our teachers didn't always feel safe before to make changes. And then in the midst of a pandemic, most of our teachers felt very unsafe just generally. So I saw, as I took over a new school, school new to me in the last year, that people reverted, even though we had been trying to do lots of things differently since 2015. They went back to a more safe space where Sage at the Stage was their thing. And that I've seen in the last several months, both since we've been back in person, but also even in the last 6 or 8 months, that once they knew it was okay to fail and move forward, to really learn from their mistakes, that they were willing to make those transitions online using ed tech as well. And so I think that our ability to create safe spaces for our teachers to make a difference is huge. And again, time will tell in the next few years about whether or not we've learned or not.
Thank you. One more. Yes. Just wait for the mic. Yeah. There we are.
I could hear very clearly that. That was great.
Good evening, everybody. Carolina Gomez, blended learning specialist from the Netherlands with my students. I am in favor of Hillary Steen, and I'm gonna go for the first. I don't remember your name. Donald is the teacher next to you.
Jürgen.
Okay. I really love what you pinpointed about didactics and pedagogy being embedded into a format that we all have to follow, screen sharing, or just try to put or reduce how beautiful and how much foundation has pedagogy and didactics in the classroom to be limited to a blended format or just to follow online instructions of a video conference class. So I am in favor of keeping the authenticity of pedagogy alive and not letting us change it to a technological format, because at the end, didactics is creating a learning experience for the learners, and people can learn and you can feel engaged and you can motivate learners to give the best. So I am in favor, and I know that we have learned many lessons from COVID, but I do not agree that didactics is growing with the blended formats. It's decreasing, and teachers are losing their identity, and teachers are leaving all the pedagogical, beautiful years that we learned in our bachelor. So I love that you are defending teachers, because teachers are usually in the left place. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you for that, and thank you, all of you, for your contributions. I'm sorry that the time is running short. This is a parliamentary-style debate, so at this stage in the proceedings, really, you should all be inebriated. So the bar is still open. You've still got time to get a drink. And in the meantime, before we move to the vote, I'm going to ask both sides to sum up, and I'm going to ask Mark first for the opposition to sum up. You've got 5 minutes, Mark.
Thank you.
Yes.
10 minutes. 5.
5.
Thank you.
5 each.
Okay, yeah.
We've heard some excellent and important arguments, but I want to go back to our motion, that we have failed to learn lessons. I heard a lot of you in the audience talk about the lessons that you have extracted. These are important lessons. The point you made about didactics being forced into templates and into molds, that is a very important lesson that we have drawn. We've drawn the lesson early, too. We're lucky in the education sector. Imagine if media had gotten this sort of taste of what it's like to move fully into a digital format before this happened in a sort of haphazard way. Imagine if even politics had had this sort of experience to move sort of in one jump into a digital format to sort of see what changes. We've had a preview of what our digital future might entail. And whether you think that's bright or whether you think that's dark, we have extracted valuable lessons. We will all go forward with the digital transformation of education wiser. We have experience under our belt. It's not just local experience, it's global experience. We saw how this thing played out in every single country around the world. There was not a country in the world that didn't have school closures and didn't attempt to move education wholesale to technology. What a wonderful learning experience, and how many lessons we have drawn. We don't all have to draw the same lessons. Some people found technology enormously exciting, innovative. It was a place for all sorts of new experiences. Other people, as I painted in some of my remarks, saw a very dark picture, saw an experience where education was greatly diminished, where the educational experience really narrowed and was impoverished. But no matter how you come down on it, we did learn. We did take away key experiences. Again, we can disagree on what the key learnings are, and we need to have this conversation. But I think one thing is for sure, we will be better for it. We have seen what will happen if we go with the flow. We have seen what education looks like when we just ask education to sort of contort to the digital logics that exist with us today. And I think most of us can agree, we need a new course. We need a new orientation for the digital transformation of education. We need to move into a paradigm where technology serves learners, serves teachers, serves schools. We heard one of our participants talk about that education is a service. He mentioned that there was an analogy of a gym membership. And Rupert, I'm sorry, I beg to disagree. Education is a human right. It is not a gym membership. It is not something that anybody should have to pay for. It is something that benefits all of us. And we need to be sure that when education moves into digital spaces or continues to move into digital spaces, that we protect that understanding that education is a right and is a public good. As an example, with the analogy of personalized learning, many students around the world experienced personalized learning with the pandemic for the first time. But many of those students found it incredibly isolating. They were at home on their own, and then they were following a learning journey that was all on their own. Their friends were going other directions. It was not a shared and communal experience. Interestingly, countries that did television broadcasts as a response to the pandemic, Mexico, for instance, they had students across the country watching, of the same age, watching the same channel at the same time across the nation. But it created a community around education. It created something like watching a sporting event or something else, where there was a sort of shared sense of we're in this together. We're experiencing the same learning. Again, what lessons you draw from that, that's up to you. But there were lessons that we extracted, and we can see different directions for how we might want to steer this digital transformation for education. So with that, I implore you to vote no on this motion. I don't know how you can vote yes. Surely there have been lessons learned. I felt very bad for the opposition, and they have shared many of the great lessons that they have extracted. When you really unpack what they're saying, they are lessons, and valuable lessons, even lessons I agree with. So again, please vote no on the motion, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you.
Remain seated.
Thank you very much. Now I'm going to call on Jürgen to speak for the motion, to sum up in favor of the motion.
Yes, thank you very much. We remain seated because Hillary and I will do it together. First of all, we are very happy. We are very happy that we have one follower at least. So, Mark, one will be for us. Thank you very much. And the second thing is, of course, what I do not like is that technology dominates almost everything in what we've heard. I'm looking back to my experience with technology, and I can tell you, I have not added a single technological entity to my teaching as compared with pre-corona. I'm still using the same things. So technology has never driven my approach towards didactics. And we quickly have to reverse that as soon as possible. But my summary is not going to support the motion only. I want, and to address what we did not learn, I rather want to tell you what we should have learned. Because that's, for me, the important thing. Number one, we should have learned that frontal content delivery, whether on campus or remote, should no longer be part of our teaching methods. And we have not learned that lesson. Second, knowledge tests should no longer be relics, should be relics of the past. Non-proctored competence tests should become the rule. We haven't learned that. And then, very important for those who preach digital scenarios, do they actually live the scenarios? There are so many people who are talking about it, but they have never actually lived such a scenario, have been a teacher in an inverted classroom, have been part of an online scenario. So don't just talk about it, live it. And then we need more digital content. The Moodle man in the back will like that idea. But we should use open educational resources much more than we did ever before. There are OER platforms on campus in Germany, free. There are platforms, Harold mentioned our platform, the Virtual Linguistics Campus. We should compile material from all sorts of existing sources. We don't have to reinvent the wheel in terms of creating digital content. Mechanics 1, the Old Testament, fundamentals in physics, lyrics, all these are fundamental courses that can be digitized without using Zoom, without using just podcasts or something like that. And as I said, go back to didactics drives technology. And for all these aspects to be realized, we need a new mindset, which was not created during Corona, a mindset of collaboration and cooperation. A new culture of failure because these new scenarios won't work at first try. A general appreciation of teaching by the institutions. Not only research must be career building, but teaching. And then we make big progress. And we need full institutional support, even if only mental. Last but not least, don't talk. Just do it. And now Hilary will say something about the students.
Yes. So fundamentally, what the motion has said is that education has not learned the lessons of COVID. And so as a student, every student can tell you that to learn, not just to list out lessons, to learn is to be intentional, not reactive, to be willing, not forced. It means to be considered and receptive to change. And so education did not learn the lessons if student mental health, if students suffering from financial hardship because of fees, with students not being able to engage or have access to education, has made it so that these long-standing issues have only now come to the awareness of education years and years and years after it had been spoken about by students for years and years and years. So please, don't just think that this motion is about listing the lessons of COVID-19. Really think, has education learned the lessons, acted on the lessons of COVID-19? And if you're really honest with yourself, if you're really vulnerable here in this space to really think about that question deeply, especially thinking about your students who have pushed through and trusted you, you'll know that education has not learned the lessons of COVID-19, and it should do in the future, now and in the future. So thank you, and please vote for our side.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all our panel speakers and to all of you. So we're now going to take a vote on the motion that this House believes education has failed to learn the lesson of COVID-19. All those in favour of the motion, please raise your right hand, or your left hand if you prefer, but not both. That's all those in favour of the motion. Right, and all those against?
Even.
Yeah.
What?
Definitely one.
Give a round of applause.
Difficult.
I would say that the motion is carried, just. Just. Thank you very much indeed. That was a very narrow margin, I think, either way.
Harold.
That's the privilege of the chair. You get to decide these things.
Okay.
Thank you all very much indeed, and don't forget the bar's still open, I think.